My name is Jacqueline Cantwell, and I've been asked by OCLC to speak about my program that will be reported at the American Association of Law Libraries in July of 2008. How can law libraries reach out to people who want legal information but are unaware of law libraries? How can we promote law libraries as reliable sources for legal information? The content we develop in Pathfinders and legal research guides are often part of the deep web and may not be easily found. Over the next year, I will be experimenting with WorldCat.org's social software tools to help our patrons. In addition to using WorldCat.org as a reference tool, I am experimenting with identifying resources for collection development and staff training. Because legal reference is so oriented to the patron's question, frequently a serious matter that requires procedural knowledge, it is easy for a legal reference to librarian to forget that one of the library's missions is to reveal relationships. What we call subject headings, web users call tags, and these web users recognize that these tags identify relationships. Those relationships have not been defined well in the catalog, not only because of technology limitations, but because relationships are defined by point of view and need. Relationships are not stable. WorldCat.org lists can group books by how well they answer questions, needs, or address a point of view. Relationships not obvious in the catalog can be brought out by lists. For a law library, this is very important. The traditional catalog in a public access law library is not a strong tool because our large multi-volume sets can answer many questions but are frequently cataloged with a single subject heading. In the second part of this presentation, I will demonstrate this. The traditional catalog in a public access law library is not a strong tool because our large multi-volume sets can answer many questions but are frequently cataloged with a single subject heading. An example is New York jurisprudence, a huge encyclopedia, over 100 volumes, covering topics in New York state law such as animals, vicious dogs, adjoining neighbors, and landlord-tenant law. However, the average user would not think to go to New York State jurisprudence to answer a question on neighbor law. And I'll give you an example why. Clicking on Advanced Search, I'm going to search for New York jurisprudence. I'm waiting for the page to load. I'm clicking on the title. New York jurisprudence is correctly cataloged with a single subject heading, Law, New York State. That's not enough information to guide an unfamiliar user to this book. Instead of going to this book to answer a question on neighbor law, the patron would Google the problem and get varied sources, none leading him to a public, tax-funded, public access law library. Users are going to WorldCat.org. If a user went to WorldCat.org and selected Search Lists, Neighbor Law, as I'll show, waiting again for the page to load. I'm going to open the page, and I'll continue this in my next session. Once the user had selected neighbor law, he would be able to open the list. Waiting for the page to load. Thank you. All of the lists I've made so far are flagged with New York Legal Research, and my profile is under KSC Law Library. In the description, I've included terms that a user might use for searching. All of these terms are searchable in the list file. Adjoining landowners, boundaries, dogs, pets, swimming pools. I've also included a disclaimer about how this is not to be considered as legal advice and is only the beginning of legal research. That's extremely important for any kind of law library, to make users aware that this is not considered legal advice. Scrolling down, you'll notice that I've been able to add entries to each of these titles, so the user would be guided as to useful subject headings and to chapters. Particularly, I want you to see what's available for New York jurisprudence. I've been able to guide users to the chapters in this 100-volume set on adjoining landowners, animals, buildings, easements, and nuisances. I've even been able to lead a user to the book New York Law of Torts, where there's a whole chapter on nuisance. A user might not think to go to that book, neither might a librarian. So both the user and the librarian at the reference desk have been alerted to the usefulness of the books contained in the library. WorldCat.org's potential includes the ability to identify the usefulness of a book. An example is Patrick Wall's eyewitness identification. I'll resume with my next session. Patrick Wall's eyewitness identification in criminal cases is a classic work in legal research. However, a newly graduated librarian would not be alerted to that. The title is somewhat old for a law library. Identifying core reference materials published after World War II is a hit-and-miss affair. Our field relies upon the knowledge of experienced librarians who not only know what books are important, but how those books can be used to answer questions. We need to capture this knowledge. The way I've been able to do that is I've put a review. I've taken advantage of the review format here. I've identified this as a classic on mistaken identification. I've alerted the user to the frequency that this book has been cited in legal cases, and I've also alerted a reader to a prominent author who reviewed the book in 1965. To identify books published for practicing attorneys after World War II, I went through back copies of the Brooklyn Law Review, NY Law Review, and other major law schools. Once I found a review of a New York practice work, I made a note in the review field that a review had been published on that book. Ideally, WorldCat.org should list reviews written by my profile. These review notes could be used during reading and staff training. These notes would give new staff the grounds for a book's influence. To identify how books are used, I am working with New York court librarians to create a reference question tracking database. This database is still being tweaked, but it has the potential to identify frequent questions for lists and also identify which books answer which questions. I hope to add notes to book records pointing out the strengths of a book. A librarian could use the WorldCat.org note to get background on a book's usefulness. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please contact me at the email displayed on the screen if you have any questions or comments. I also want to thank OCLC for sponsoring this presentation, the American Association of Law Libraries for accepting my program proposal, and to my colleagues at the New York State Unified Court System who have been really wonderful in helping me in this project and offering their comments. Thank you again. I look forward to your remarks.